I know this location is familiar to many of you who have been to some of our programs for the Stanford Historical Society, or perhaps some of you were here as students yourselves at the law school. Maybe some of you were at the law school at the old location over at the main quad. Regardless, welcome one and all, and Happy New Year. We're still in January, so I think it's still fair to wish everyone a Happy New Year. My name is Victor Madrigal, class of 94. I work at the Stanford Alumni Association, and I'm one of the Historical Society board members. And it's my privilege to welcome all of you today and introduce you to our speakers and to the program. It's a three-part program. We've got Daniel Hartwig, who is our Stanford University archivist. We have Alison Carpenter Davis, our author, whose book, and this is going to be a shameless plug, you're welcome. The Stanford bookstore is outside, so afterward you'll be able to purchase your book and get it autographed. There might be a long, long line, so make sure you wait patiently. Alison is going to introduce some of her special guests who are going to read excerpts from her book, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So make yourselves comfortable for today's presentation. I'm going to use my notes to introduce, just to make sure that I don't misspell, misrepresent, or spread any alternative facts this evening. So we began by introducing, like I said, Daniel Hartwig, who also sits on our Historical Society board. He's been here since 2010, and prior to coming to Stanford, from 2006 to 2010, Hartwig was a record services archivist at a small little school out east, Yale University. Maybe you've heard of it. Previously, Daniel was assistant archivist and digital projects developer at Ball State University from 2004 to 2006, and archives reference assistant at the Wisconsin Historical Society. He's a graduate of University of Iowa, holds an MA from Indiana University, and an MLIS from the University of Wisconsin. Raffle prize. Who knows what MLIS is?
Library Science.
There we go. Raffle prize is you get a free presentation this evening. Wonderful.
You get a copy of the book.
You get a copy. Daniel Hartwig will talk about his work as our university archivist and also how it has set the stage for the work that our author and our guest speaker today has done with her book. So Daniel will go ahead and speak first, but I'm also going to go ahead and introduce Alison Carpenter Davis to make sure that we've got a nice program flow. So Alison graduated from Stanford in 1979. Her reunion year is coming up in a couple of years. I hope to see you on the committee, perhaps. I work reading homecoming. It's my job to also do that. Her parents attended Stanford, if my research serves me right, back in the 1940s. And I'll let her tell you a little bit more about her family connections to Stanford in just a bit. She is the author of Letters Home from Stanford, 125 Years of Correspondence. Her articles have run in various publications, including the Stanford Magazine, the Chicago Tribune, the International Herald Tribune, and the Des Moines Register, just to name a few. And prior to becoming an author, Alison was an editor at Outside Magazine and an adjunct professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. She will invite and introduce her speakers as the program continues, but I wanted to make sure to introduce the two of them. Like I said earlier, you are going to be able to purchase your own copy of the book. I was going to say the Stanford Magazine; those are complimentary. The book is outside, available through the Stanford Bookstore. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Daniel Hartwig.
Thank you, and thank you for coming out for tonight's celebration of archives. Everybody hear me okay? So the University Archives is the official institutional memory for Stanford University. So we collect university records, records of administrators, units, offices, departments, but also records of organizations, student organizations, and individuals. Now, the important difference between primary and secondary resources. So secondary resources, you can gain a sense of what an institution, a group, or an individual is like. But to really understand what it's like to be an individual or to experience an event, you really need to consult primary resources. So we collect journals, diaries, letters, correspondence, scrapbooks, you name it, anything and everything that you can get a sense of what it is like to be an individual, and in this particular case, a student. Now, collecting and documenting student life is a real challenge here in the University Archives, but throughout really any archives. Any ideas why it's hard to collect or to document student life? Well, for one, most students are here for 4 years. They're taking many courses each quarter. They're really not concerned with keeping track of, documenting, and preserving their materials. So they've got many more important things to think about in their time here as a student. So oftentimes things aren't kept, they're not well preserved, and therefore they don't make their way to us in the archives. So it's a real challenge for us to make sure to keep track of, to check in, and later on, hopefully when they attend reunion weekend, to make sure that materials that they have created come to us. And so we've, over the years, collected several collections of students' scrapbooks and other materials, and we've compiled one collection we call the Stanford Student Letters and Memoirs collection. We'll hear much more about that. But it's only about 5 or 6 boxes out of the tens of thousands of boxes that we have in the archive. So it's a relatively small collection. So given that relative dearth of materials we have documenting student life, we, a few years ago, worked with the Alumni Association to create what's called the Stanford Alumni Legacy Program. So this was a collecting initiative targeted at alumni, centered around reunion weekend, but also available online, to solicit materials for the archives. We're doing things a little differently, so it's not just gifts, but we're also willing to accept materials, digitize them, and return them to individuals if they so desire. So those efforts resulted in several collections of student letters, photographs, scrapbooks, you name it. And so we're very thankful in working with the Alumni Association to make those materials available. So here you see, in an effort to attract individuals, we've done a variety of things in terms of social media, cutouts, cardboards. I think Leland Jr. actually went missing this last reunion weekend, so if you do spot him, you don't necessarily need to tell us where he's at, but just make sure he's having a good time. So the Legacy project has done very well in terms of collecting materials, but we're also interested in documenting additional or using additional formats or materials to document student life. So we created what was called the Stanford Stories Project. So this was also in conjunction with Reunion Weekend, where we set up a short what we call like a booth to capture stories of alums during their time on the farm. And so we've compiled, I believe, over 70 recordings of alums back on the farm. These are all available on the Stanford Library's YouTube channel. So if you just want to Google Stanford Library's YouTube, you can access all of these Stanford stories. Now, given the success of that project, we're in the midst of another project working with the oral history program to create what's called the Stanford Community History Toolkit. So this is a project to create low barrier access and instructions for individuals or communities to create their own oral histories, interviews, you name it. So either using readily available materials like your cell phone, a camera, a laptop, etc., you can record and share your story. So we'll compile all of those recordings, we'll transcribe them, and we'll make them available. So we've already got 3 projects interested in starting with this project. So one is the April 3rd movement, or the movement. So we've been working with those students who participated in many of the protests in the late 60s and early 70s. So we've scheduled a meeting in February for several to start planning that project. Another project is the Stanford trees. So
I love it.
We've worked with the last 2 trees in the archives. We've actually taken in several tree costumes. That's a whole ordeal in of itself, but they're interested in telling their story, the evolution of the Stanford tree. So that's one we're excited about. And another one in working with some faculty is the Herzenberg Lab. So Len and Lenore Herzenberg, amazing individuals, very prominent in terms of genetics, and so we're going to tell the story of their lab. Now, another project to kind of get us back on track in terms of student letters. So we don't just acquire things, we digitize them, make them available, and share them for teaching, learning, and research. Students who projects we're very excited to talk about is called From the Page. So we've taken these digitized materials and put them on this website, and we allow individuals to transcribe them. So what we do is we take these transcriptions that individuals submit, and we can make them full text searchable in our online environment. So we have around 13 collections now available online, including all of the papers of Leland, Jane, and Leland Jr. We have several faculty collections, the aforementioned student letters collection, and a pioneering sex survey of the late 1890s of Stanford women. Here's just a screenshot where you can see on the left-hand side we have a handwritten text, and on the right you can see the transcription that the user generates. So all of these materials will then be made available through our exhibit site. So this is just exhibits.stanford.edu. You can see several exhibits, online exhibits that we already have, but all of these letters will be made available through there. And just yesterday, we were contacted by another partner who's interested in extending the efforts of our transcription project. So there's a European Commission tool called Transcribus, which is taking machine learning and applying it to transcription. So you do automatic handwritten analysis. So we're very excited for that project to extend access to all the materials that we've collected and made available in kind of new and ever creative, innovative ways. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alison and talk about our story.
I'm just going to use this. We're good. Thanks. Thanks, Daniel. Can you all hear me okay? In the back? Louder. Is this okay now? Okay. Thanks, Daniel. It's been a pleasure to work with you and your staff these last 3 or 4 years. And Victor and Charlotte, thanks so much for all your help, and to the Historical Society for inviting me to come by today and chat with you. I'm thrilled to be here. Letters Home from Stanford, this book that recently came out, in fact, started with my mom, or rather my grandmother, who told my mom in no uncertain terms on the platform at the downtown Los Angeles train station in July of 1944 that she was to write home twice a week or tuition would be yanked. And you didn't mess with my grandmother. So my mom dutifully wrote her letters twice a week for the 4 years she was here, from 1944 to 1948. And we now have 4 binders stuffed with letters representing the 4 years of my mom's Stanford career. Here's one of her letters from 1945, or 45, yeah. At some point in my late 20s, I decided to read through some of them, and I was shocked by how much her own college experience resonated with my own. I'd always thought my life experiences were so unique and were so different from my mother's, and we certainly had not much in common at all. And then I had this aha moment that I think a lot of young people do, perhaps at some point, that my mom and I had a lot more in common than I'd previously thought. I wrote about, in the preface to the book, for those of you who've read it, I wrote about my mom's letters being the inspiration for the book, and in fact they were. But there's a little bit more to the story. Decades pass. About 5 or 6 years ago, I set out to find my old P.O. box at Stanford, which was a very important point on campus for me. P.O. Box 5951. I couldn't find it. So I found myself standing on the steps of the post office. You know exactly where that is, right there at the bottom of the photo. This is the view I had. I'm looking at the post office, and all of a sudden I start thinking back to my mom's letters, which I hadn't turned to in years, and all the words and stories that have gone in and out of this building and other buildings. This would have been the post office where my mom mailed her letters home. And before that, the telegraph office that was here when the school opened in 1891. And I'm thinking of all these words and all these stories and all these buildings. And then I start thinking about electronic correspondence and how students don't write letters so much anymore. It's pretty much about emails and really not emails anymore, texts, and I guess Snapchat. There's no Snapchats in the book. I drew the line there. And Letters Home from Stanford was born on the steps of the post office. The book is a collection of handwritten, electronic, and typed correspondence that Stanford students have sent home for 125 years. And just in general, it recalls the common human experience of breaking out and trying to find our way as we observe the world around us and look over a shoulder toward home, often not wanting to admit to ourselves or anybody else around us that we're doing that. So why come out with this book? Why do we care? Why did I care so much? Because letters are pieces of history. The country's, the world's, our own personal histories, and in this case, Stanford's. Historians often consider letters to be the best primary sources for their research because they are firsthand accounts, unlike memoirs, which can be written months or even years later. Secondly, the letters establish and remind us of the common threads that bind together the generations, and I think that is grounding for people and it brings them joy, perhaps even more so in these fractured times in which we live. The letters show change. Many things stay the same, many change, and that's often a good thing. And it is my hope that the letters inspire today's students. I cannot emphasize this enough. When a straight-A student comes from high school and shows up on campus here, it's my hope that it's really helpful for them to see that someone in the 1950s, maybe somebody I know in the 1970s, that would be me, and many other people landed here, and guess what? They got a D their first quarter at Stanford, and they lived through it, and it's happened before, and it goes on. And reading the letters and observing how students before them have faced similar transitions. A few bits of housekeeping. Sorry, I'm going to take another quick sip. When I refer to letters throughout this talk, I'm referring to all correspondence. I view emails and texts as modern-day letters. All the correspondence throughout is credited to the Stanford University Archives, which, as Daniel said, they hold all of this correspondence in their wonderful Stanford Student Letters and Memoirs collection. And while I'll obviously focus on some specifics related to Stanford here today, there's so much of the book, if you didn't attend Stanford, there's so much of the book that's about growing up and setting out, and you don't need to have gone to Stanford to relate to it. After all, each of us was once 18 or 19 years old. Okay, the remainder of the talk breaks into three sections: what the letters reveal about what hasn't changed. Then some members of the Stanford community have been nice enough to do some readings. And then we'll talk about what the letters reveal about what has changed. So what do students write home about? The larger categories would be their everyday lives, their participation of or observations of campus events, and their feelings about worldwide events. So in the world of the everyday, what themes emerged across the generations? Freshman fumbling, and this became a lot of the letters in the first chapter of the book, First Letters Home. Here's a quote from Chris Seaman. I haven't met anyone from Modesto yet, but I know a guy who knows a girl he thinks is from Modesto. This is called searching for a connection. Your first week at Stanford. The push and pull with home that I'm sure we can all remember. Wanting separation, but wanting the next day to talk to your parents or write them a letter, and just sort of this yin and yang that goes on about wanting to be home and setting the parameters as a student for what your parents are to do when they're on campus. For example, this young woman wrote, "Don't kiss me and talk out loud in the library when you come." This is Lucy Allebach, and she was writing to her mother in Iowa prior to her mother's visit to campus. I often ask audiences to guess when they thought this was written, and I'm thinking a lot of people in this room are familiar enough with the book, so people are going to get it right. But I asked one audience, and someone said, "I think that was texted like last fall." Here's the date on that one. And I love this because in a nutshell, this is one of the main themes of the book. Forget the date. This could have been written, texted, painted on, a piece of paper, whatever. So you've got the push and pull with home. This is another one from a freshman. I miss you guys, I really do. You're a great family, and I might as well admit it. There are lots and lots of letters, about correspondence. Why haven't you written? I'm so sorry I haven't written. And then there's a lovely one, 3 paragraphs about thank you for the lovely letter, and I promise I'll write more. And then, of course, there's often, and then 4 paragraphs in building to the punchline, can you send money? You see in this one, that's it for now. Please send what I asked for. This is from a student in the 60s, and then he's constructed the word write. Please send are the 2 most common words put together in all the correspondence. And then please send, fill in the blank, and the number 1 fill in the blank is money. Let's see. There's letters about life of the intellect, students being excited and inspired about what they learned in class that day. This is life, and there's struggles. There's struggles with finances, academics, roommates, relationships. I didn't want the book to be all rah-rah all the time because that's not life and it's not reality. So I wanted to be sure and include some excerpts that weren't funny and where students were really struggling. I call this is your classic dorm shot from the quad in the 70s. I call this the face in the crowd photo. There's a freshman in this photo who didn't feel comfortable talking on the phone with her parents about her struggles, nor did she talk with a single person on campus about them. But she did feel comfortable writing her parents in a letter about what was going on. And she was having serious questions about, why am I here? I feel like I'm flunking all my classes. And she had this to say to them. She was really having a hard adjustment. I've never felt like a complete failure, and it's hard to accept a failure. I find letters like this really interesting because there's no other vehicle except through this letter. I actually know this person, and I know for a fact she spoke to no one on campus about it. And we would not know this information and know how this person felt in the mid-1970s unless we had this letter. So I find that special about letters like this, and I feel it's a view into an interior Stanford when students are writing about things that they're not talking about. This she wrote after a midterm that she was sure she had flunked. It was a midterm in England. In econ, the subject she went on to major in. And the grade she got on the test, she got a B. And of course, she makes it through Stanford just fine, earning her degrees in economics and psychology 4 years later. She has a beautiful letter that she writes right before she graduates, and she's walking all around the quad, kind of doing a Stations of the Cross, looking at different classrooms and remembering the teachers, the professors in those rooms and what she learned. It's just a beautiful letter. And there's other pre-graduation letters. That would be another theme. Students tend to get very reflective before graduation. Okay, moving on to the history side of things. Students like to write about big game, any surprise, and the Stanford-Cal rivalry in general. I really had to trim things down for the Beat Cal chapter, and there definitely had to be a Beat Cal chapter. And this is probably one of the single biggest things that binds students across generations at Stanford. Here we have a slide of the first Stanford football game. This is the one, there is a letter. I believe it was March 1892. There's a letter describing this game, and this is the game I'm sure many of you have heard of where both teams forgot the ball, and somebody had to go off on horseback to find a ball, and the game started about an hour and a half late. Next up, we have what has become a beloved quote in Letters Home. It's written by a young woman, a freshman named Hope Snedden. December 1st, 1918. Hope is relaying the score to her father, Cal 67, Stanford 0, and telling him that her friend from Cal is ribbing her a lot about it. And she's like, I don't care. And then she writes, all the same, I'm glad I didn't go to Berkeley. I will tell you this score is not kept in official Stanford record books because the 1918 football team included both student and non-student members of the the Student Army Training Corps, a unit headquartered on campus during World War I. As we know, Stanford students like to beat Cal at anything and everything and on and off the field, including selling war bonds during the 1940s. Carol Stearns says to her mother, "Did you hear about it? A race between Cal and Stanford with the Axis prize, which is the school that sold the most. We won." This cracks me up. This is parallel universes. It's two students at a big game over 100 years apart. One of them says in the 1890s, "I did not know what I was doing." He was jumping up and down, and he was relaying to his parents, writing this letter that, frankly, I just got hysterical, and I didn't really even know what I was doing. Another is from one of our Letters Home from Stanford interns, Jason Cedar, who's here tonight. And he's actually talking, his mom's asking him about the band, and he says, "I still have no clue what I'm doing." And I actually had thought of doing a spread in the book about these parallel things like this, but I didn't. This would be an example. Okay, let's look at further history. The book opens with a letter written by Lucy Auerbach the day before the first day of classes at the Young University. Here she describes her new surroundings at Robley Hall. The parlor has rough walls, as have all the rooms, painted in delicate shades. Ours is light blue and ecru. The parlor is pale pink and blue. And I can't say this is the exact parlor she was talking about, but this parlor is from that era. And I feel with her words, she's coloring this photo for us. And I just love that. They literally color this Robley Hall parlor. This is from Jane Stanford's funeral in 1905. There's a letter that goes along with this where, same thing, all the wreaths that have been sent for the day are sitting in front, and he talks about them in very colorful terms. These are a bunch of students the day of the Loma Prieta earthquake. This is also interesting to me, just a side note, to see a bunch of students around a TV, right? That would not be the case today. People would be doing this. And there's a letter by Dan Lithcott-Hames about the experience of going through the earthquake. He tells his father, "Until it happens, it's impossible to fathom just how it makes you feel. It's like living on a military target range." Beyond that, the group of letters where students are thinking about things off campus. This is by my mom, and she's talking about the Dewey Roosevelt election. "In a democracy, there should not be any man so indispensable that he can't be removed at any time. And if there is a man so indispensable, then the government is no longer a democracy, and I'm awfully afraid American democracy is at an end." This is a letter written also by Hope Snedden. It's about her and a lot of the girls in Robley Hall running into Palo Alto in the middle of the night to celebrate the end of World War I. This is a Stanford Daily the day after JFK was shot, and a letter beside it written the same day from a young man named Gary. The first sentence is, "The university is in a state of mourning." He goes on to describe the mood on campus and also the fact it was big game weekend, and many of the festivities that weekend were canceled. What I'm also struck about in this letter is the listing in the archives. When you go to look it up, it's just Gary. And I can't help but, it's a kid named Gary. And how many kids that day wrote letters like this? I have to think there was a lot of traffic at post offices after that day. Okay, now we come to the readings portion of today's presentation. First of all, we've got Sherry Gould Blaisdell, I should say. She graduated from Stanford in 1984 with degrees in econ and political science. This is her graduation photo on the left. She is a CPA, lives in Los Altos, and is the daughter of longtime Stanford tennis coach Dick Gould, and the great-granddaughter of Mabel Babe Bartlett, whose letter about the 1906 earthquake is in the archives and appears in Letters Home. Sherry?
Thank you. Babe Bartlett was a Stanford sophomore when the earthquake hit in April 1906. about the time that this photo was taken. My great-grandmother left Stanford.
I'm going to need for you to hold that because we're not getting enough.
Okay. Is this better? My great-grandmother left Stanford that year and never returned to finish her degree. She married and raised a family with her childhood sweetheart, Thomas Gould Jr., in their hometown of Ventura, California. In this letter from the History at the Farm chapter in the book, Babe writes to her parents while sitting outside her residence hall while the earth beneath her rumbles with aftershocks. April 18th, 1906. Dearest folks, strange to say, I'm still alive. I never heard such a noise in all my life, and things were just flying all over my room. I seemed to be perfectly crazed. All the other girls have some thoughts, but I don't think I thought a single thing. We are sitting out on the lawn now, waiting for another shock. Goodbye if the earth swallows us up. We're hoping for the best and are really quite cheerful. Not a soul in our house was even scratched, but Mrs. Spencer was thrown from bed and sprained her ankle. It was about 5 o'clock that it happened. We chased out on the porch in our kimonos barefoot, some in their nightgowns and blankets, etc. You never saw such an array and a variety of clothes. After the shock subsided, we went in and put on clothes enough to go to the quad. We could see that the church steeple wasn't to be seen. Every chimney on the campus is down, even the great big one. It fell through them, killed the engineer. Those buildings are wrecks. The church is a mass of ruins, can see clear through it, simply can't describe its ruin. The memorial arch is down, crushed the arches around. The arcades in lots of places are destroyed. The new gym and library are utterly demolished, nothing but the frame of the dome standing. These buildings haven't been accepted yet, so guess the contractors will have to stand the loss. The big gates are just a pile of stone. The chimneys fell through Robley and took the floors with them. 3 girls fell through the floor, but no one was hurt over there. Joy, I'm glad I don't live there. Encina had the same misfortune. The air shafts fell through, taking all the rooms through to the basement with their occupants. The boys were working hard, digging the poor fellows out. One was dead and the others badly hurt. Guess the hospital was full. I'll bet there was lots of heroic work done around by all the boys and everybody. The Kaisai house is the worst of the residences. It is shoved over to one side and all collapsed like a card playhouse. The earthquake could not have been at a better time. Light, yet all were in bed, just before the fires were started for breakfast, because the stoves and chimneys are all to pieces. We finally had some coffee and bread for breakfast, cooked things on a campfire in the backyard. Just think, if folks had been on the quad, hundreds would have been killed. It is perfectly miraculous that any of us are alive. Sadie's bed collapsed with her. We are all planning to sleep outdoors tonight. Heavens, I'll live in mortal terror of another. I forgot to tell you. I got just this far when there was one horrid shock and I leaped wildly off the porch. It's over now. As I was saying, well, another terrible shock, and off I leaped. The house was just twisting. I'm on the lawn again now. There are lots of little shakers, but I'm so brave now, I don't mind little shocks. I was just about to tell you that the terrific shock predicted this morning didn't come. Just slight ones like this afternoon. They say the earth is apt to open. I filed a telegram to be sent to you as soon as the wires are in shape. Heavens, I'm praying you are all right, and only wish you knew I was so. I know you're about crazy. No doubt you've heard terrible rumors. It certainly has never been equaled. Dr. Jordan said nowhere in the world was there such a demolition of stone buildings. I had 5 pictures left in my Brownie Kodak camera, so took it with me this morning before they shut off the quad. Pali is in ruins, so guess I couldn't get any more films. I was lucky to have that many. I don't see when we can begin work. Of course, they'll have to inspect all the buildings before we can have class. Lots of the arches that are perfect otherwise have their keystones just hanging, so you see nothing is safe. Madrono is condemned and not a soul can enter. Poor homeless girls. I tell you there are lots homeless. The inspectors are just here. Say, I want to tell you something really funny out of all this disaster. One of the big statues in front of the zoology building took a headlong plunge and poked his old head right through the cement and is standing there, heels in the air. I never imagined I'd ever see ruins like these, just like old castle ruins. Whoever thought yesterday that this morning Stanford, all its wonderful, massive buildings, would be in ruins? Well, I guess I'll quit. Can't do any good to rave on thusly, so goodbye. Heavens, how I wish I could hear from you. The sky is all overcast with smoke from San Francisco. Maya gives the atmosphere a funny, spooky feeling. Lots and lots of love to all, Babe. So this is one of the 5 photographs that my great-grandmother took with her Polaroid camera that day in 1906. She then wrote this in a follow-up letter the next day. There were quakes all day and night. They say this will be the ruin of California for 10 years anyway. Folks won't send their children back here to college. Thank you. And now I have the pleasure of introducing someone near and dear to my heart. Dick Gould, class of 1959, grew up on the Gould family farm in Ventura, California. He earned his MA in secondary education at Stanford in 1960. While at Stanford, Dick played on the tennis team, as we see in the photo, going on to become one of Stanford's most legendary coaches. Dick retired just 3 days ago as the John L. Hines Director of Tennis after a total of 58 years as a Stanford student, coach, and director of tennis. As coach for 38 years, Dick led the Stanford tennis team to 17 national championships, more than any other NC2A tennis coach, and more than any other coach in the history of Stanford in any sport. Dick's 6-hour oral history of tennis and sport at Stanford has recently been published by the Stanford Historical Society. Thank you. Please give a warm welcome to Babe's grandson and my father, Dick Gould.
Oh my gosh. First week retirement and talking to Los Altos Rotary today and get to be here tonight with all of you. I guess I'm not quite retired, but thanks for being here. And I want to take this opportunity to say this book, if you haven't read it, is really, really fun to read. There are so many similarities from 100 years ago apart. Everyone has the same fears, the same things don't change. And it's light, it's fun. The excerpts are from all over, and Alison did a great job of categorizing them, putting them in their place, and I found it fascinating. It was just a great read. And Sherry, thank you so much. I'm so proud of you, of course, and thank you for introducing me. Did you write home for money? My dad, Richard Bartlett Gould, was Mabel Bartlett's son. My father and Sherry's grandfather received his BA in economics, barely. He was admitted to law school, but it was during the Depression, didn't go. But I looked at his transcript and got the feeling that no one else applied to law school. It was pretty. His dad was a lawyer, went to Michigan Law School, but was really a gentleman lawyer and a full-time farmer. And my dad, during the Depression, followed up and was a farmer as well. Served in many local boards in Ventura, and very proud of all he did to help the community. At Stanford, he played on the Goof Squad. That was what they called the backup JVs, really. We see him stood up in this photo, and I'll tell you, football was love. He wrestled a little bit too, but football was his love, and he wasn't going to play. He played both ways in those days. A guy named Bill Corbus was a consensus All-American, same position, and he's referenced in this as well. His letters read like a who's who of Stanford athletics. He wrote letters home every week. His diary, same January 19th day for 4 years, had a little sentence on it. He never missed a day in his diary, all from Stanford. Just a fascinating account of his experiences here. But football was really a big part of his life. he had a chance to play under the great Pop Warner, or practice under the great Pop Warner, and here's one of his letters home. It was actually written on my birthday, October 1, 1931, however. Dear folks, the football squad has officially been divided now, and Buck Van Dellen, Dave Packard, and I are on the first string. When Dick M. gets out of the hospital, again, I think he can make the first string end. Not bad for the Alpha Delts. Pop is working on a new system this year. The Goofs are learning all ASC plays and formations that the scouts pick up. And we're to give the varsity some practice against that system. Pop is sure gunning for them this year. It's sort of now or never, it seems. We have 2 real games ourselves and several practice scrimmages with JCs. This morning I registered, and everything worked out just as I had planned, so I'm sitting pretty. Tomorrow classes begin and play stops. It will be sort of a tough change, but that was, after all, what we were in college for. May 29th, 1932, spring practice. And I loved it. Wednesday, it was terribly hot, and of course I scrimmaged the whole time. Excuse me. We put in as much time as a game without any quarters or halves to rest. Boy, was I sure tired. I lost a little over 5 pounds in about 2 hours. Friday was a lot cooler, but luck wasn't quite so good. Bill Corbus, the consensus All-American I mentioned, was in Los Angeles for interviews. And as I was the first guard that answered Pop's call, I played in his place. Did Pop ever give me hell? I went pretty lousy on offense, but I was a little better on defense. I scrimmaged the whole time anyway. Pop learned my name on Friday, but I'm afraid the way he learned it won't do me much good. He figured I was about the worst football player he'd ever seen. I stand pretty well with Tiny. That's Tiny Thornhill, became a coach later on. And Rabbit, I think that's Rabbit Bradshaw, gives me quite a little help. By the way, Rabbit is going to be coaching the varsity next year, and Ernie Nevers, the great Ernie Nevers, an all-time great, the Grays. We only have 1 more week of football or 3 more practices. I hope I can give a good impression on myself these last few days. I'm enclosing the annual Alpha Delta Phi letter with this. I thought you might be interested to know just what the fellows in the house do around school. Ben Eastman has been elected track captain since the letter was written, so that can be added on to the list of achievements as well. Dick.
Thanks, Dick. We have another reader now. Her name is Elizabeth Krieger. I'm just catching up here, Elizabeth, just a sec. Elizabeth Krieger graduated from UC Davis with an English degree in 2010 and from USF with a graduate degree in creative writing. She's the eldest granddaughter of Nancy Christine Krieger. You want to come on up, Elizabeth? She's going to talk about her grandmother a little bit and then read one of her letters. Go just right here. Okay, this is the intro and that's the letter. You're good. You can help that if you want. You start right here.
Okay, thank you. Hi. So I'm Nancy's granddaughter. When Nancy Christine Smith drove cross-country to Stanford in the summer of 1946, little did she know how entwined her life would become with the university. At Stanford, Nancy lived at Hilltop House, then a residence for female graduate students, which stood on what is now the back lawn of Lou Henry Hoover House, home to Stanford's presidents. In this photo, Nancy sits with fellow students in her black shorts and white blouse on the Hilltop House lawn. Behind her, in the photo's far right corner, is 622 Cabrillo Avenue. 10 years later, Nancy would move into that house with her husband, Stanford Professor of Medicine, Dr. William P. Krieger, having earned her MA in economics in 1947 at Stanford and subsequently working as an editor for the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. During her 62 years at 622, Nancy lived next door to 7 Stanford presidents, raised 4 children, ushered in nervous undergrads arriving for med school interviews with her husband, which I heard were extremely nerve-wracking, and was a surrogate mother to literally hundreds of Stanford students who boarded at the Krieger home, many of whom wrote our family upon her death this past August. Nana was always quick and had a brilliant sense of humor. Her own resilience constantly drew me to visit her, particularly when I was going through cancer treatment at age 18. In this letter from First Letters Home chapter, Nancy describes some of her first impressions at Stanford. Friday evening, September 27th, 1946. Dear Mother, Stanford's really wonderful. It's really a scream the way I've conditioned myself to the surroundings. I expect people to be friendly, and consequently, I myself am terrifically friendly. Heavens, I think nothing of sitting down at lunch with some boys I've never seen before, and we have a nice chat as though we were old friends. But I'm sure I'll go around with beaming countenance all the time and thus practically force people to be nice to me. Who knows? But anyway, the atmosphere is about the nicest I've ever seen. The sales girls and men in the shops all around the vicinity are so nice. Waitresses, too. They're all so friendly and helpful. Really something compared to New England. My courses are really going to be tough. They've already assigned loads of books to read, and I'm still in the process of settling down. Find I'm just reading words instead of getting any sense out of my reading. I'm hoping that will soon pass once I get into the swing of things. Love to all, Nancy.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Our last reader is Kat. Kat Gregory graduated from Stanford in June 2016, and she's currently a co-term student in computer science. Her texts with her mother, her senior year, give us a sense of current student life at Stanford, recall our own student days, and of course, are a modern-day example of how so many of today's students communicate with home. I don't have a photo of Kat in the past because here she is in the present.
Thank you so much, Al, for having me here today and for compiling such a lovely list. Should I use?
Sure.
Wonderful. As we see in a series of texts to my mom from the Final Letters Home chapter, it's been a full end of the quarter. It's June 7th, 2016, 5 days before the 125th commencement at Stanford University. I was up for most of the night. June 7th, 10:41 a.m. After submitting our final natural language understanding paper at midnight, I headed over to Narnia to pull an all-nighter with my senior project team for the software fair demo today. I biked home via Lake Log as the sun was rising. Hand-wrote notes to each of my residents with end-of-the-year messages and freed them, Dobby style, with crazy socks, fuzzy socks, monster-face socks, knee-high socks, socks with Starry Night and the Scream. I heard 2 girls gasp when they opened their door, and over the course of the morning, at different places around campus, 2 other residents showed me that they were wearing their socks too. And then, since I had an hour left before our senior project team reconvened, and that's too short for a decent nap, I went on an 8-mile run in Matadero and hit my fastest time on the loop. And they say if everything's under control, you're just not going fast enough. From the same day at 2 p.m. Mom, I just got my grad gown last week, but after I got it, I went to lunch with a friend, and I realized I don't think it ever made it home to my room. My pack was loaded with packages of socks, What if it just fell out? I waited an hour in line just to pick it up. What should I do? I'm taking grad pictures with 2 different groups this afternoon, and I need at least a stole for those. At 2:24 p.m. I actually remember. It must be in my room. 2:24 p.m. But I have no idea where. 3:30 p.m. Just kidding. I found it. I'm a fool. And at 3:30 from my mom. So much for thinking things were running too smoothly. 3:30. I never said smoothly. Thank you so much.
Being the busy student that she is, Kat has to dash off. I wanted to, our last portion here, talk a little bit about what's changed. As the means by which students, one is the means by which students communicate with home. We've got a telegram. That is one sent by Babe Bartlett after the earthquake, of course, to texting. Oh, this is the one from Jason Cedar, an intern for Letters Home, where his mom asks him about his work, and he says, work, nothing but work ever in my life, which I get a kick out of. And we haven't talked about emails yet. There are emails as well in the book. This is one from a woman named Vanessa Hua. And the subject is teeth because in other parts of the email, or the email before this, the subject was her dental appointment over winter break. But I love this. This is just as people are starting to email and the dawn of much of the digital age, so is Mom becoming less afraid of computers. Another thing that's changed are the words and phrases students use. This is in one of, there are 2 letters from Herbert Hoover in the book. There are 5 letters that he wrote home from Stanford. They are held actually up at the University of Oregon libraries, but we were able to get a hold of them. And this, Dr. B, that's as in Dr. Branner, says, I can swim it. If not, he will throw in a cork. And life vests were made of cork. I was told by people at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. They were made of cork in the early 1890s. So here Herbert may be saying that if his current funds run out, perhaps Dr. B will throw him a cork or help keep him afloat financially. This is one from 1891 from Lucy Auerbach again. Well, with the best of love, I am your own faraway Lucy, who loves her mother, father, and sister if she is a crosspatch, as in a disgruntled person. And finally, I thank you very much for the very toothsome remembrances, as in delicious goodies his mother had baked and sent him. I also find this interesting because there's a formality in the writing in the early 1900s that we just don't see anymore. So that would be another example in terms of language. The letters also show what's changed in terms of things, items on campus. This is a laundry box. And those of you who've talked to me before know that this is one of my favorite things in Letters Home, all this discussion of laundry boxes. I'm just curious, is there anyone here who used a laundry box in college? I knew it. Yes, 2. Okay. For those who don't know, laundry boxes were in use by students across the country and often sold in bookstores between 1910 and 1960s. It's embarrassing how much I know about laundry boxes. But anyway, and were either aluminum or cardboard, and students would send them home with their dirty laundry. And someone at home would do the laundry, fold, perhaps press, and fold, and send back. I'm guessing it was Mom. And there's all these letters. When's the laundry box coming? I'm about to send the laundry box. I can't imagine the amount of organization in terms of keeping your clothes clean and the laundry and coming and going. And I happened to be in Washington, D.C. this fall, so I made a pilgrimage to the National Postal Museum and saw the laundry box. Another thing that's totally changed around here is there used to be engagement announcements in the Stanford Daily. This is one from the 1960s, and there's a very long letter from a student named Elaine Lavis, and there was a ceremony in her dorm, lighting of candles, all this stuff, and then this announcement in the Daily when she got engaged her senior year. One thing I'm really pleased that's come out of the book is there's a background narrative going on about the changes in the roles of women on campus and thus in society. This is Julia Hamilton Conkling saying to her mother, in the chemistry lecture class that I am in, there are 125 boys and 6 ladies, and I am one of those poor ladies. And I love this because this is women, a woman in the maths and sciences, and she went on to teach high school math for decades in El Centro, California. She also went on to get her master's at Stanford in 1916. This is a letter in the 70s written by a young woman. It's a very long letter, 6 pages, and it's all about the same topic, which is kind of unusual. Letters tend to cover 10 or 12 topics often. She's asking her mom, she's really probing with her mom how she felt about working or not working, being home with her 3 children or not. What did she give up? Her mom was a professor. Did she have regrets? What am I going to do about this? This particular student was taking the class, The Psychology of Sex Roles by Sandra Bem at the time, and she's just very caught up in this whole subject. It's a wonderful letter, and to be honest, I feel like she's speaking for a generation of women wondering this sort of thing. This is Natasha Prieta, and this was taken she came to Stanford in 1990. And I love this because this is the world has opened up to women. By 1990, more men and women are coming to Stanford from across the globe. And Natasha flies to SFO from Bombay by herself in 1990 to come to Stanford. There's a wonderful letter from her about her journey out here and her first impressions of Stanford in the First Letters Home chapter. And here we have a modern-day graduate, Lane Bruzak, class of 2016, also got her master's in design here the next year. And I think the print's pretty small here. I don't know if you can see it in the back, but just a synopsis of this text exchange with her mother. I think you will get, her mom says, I think you will get about 1,000 back from federal, as in tax returns. And this is Lane's first tax returns, and she's very excited. And she says, wow, that sounds like online shopping to me. And her mom says, that's funny. I think it sounds like first month's rent. So here we have a young woman setting out in the world. She's now actually working at the Google Idea Lab in New York City. And I love this photo of her because she is giving a presentation at a young entrepreneurs meeting. And that just sums up how far women have come, both at Stanford and in the world in general. Before I close, I just want to say it's been my profound honor to access, through Daniel and the Archives' help, the words of so many Stanford students, work with Daniel in obtaining more, plucking them out, dusting them, polishing them, and trying to put these letters together in some sort of form as best I could to give them the most meaning and resonance as possible. And before I close, there's some other people here today who I'd like to acknowledge. Everyone I've already thanked, again, the readers, this bank of, I had 4 or 5 or 6, I couldn't tell sometimes, current students who were my letters home from Stanford interns. I had editorial students, I had 1 photography intern, and I just have a new, there she is, a social media intern, which I really need. I'd also like to thank the adult children of some of the letter writers here today. And also from the Historical Society, both Dick Caudle, Dick, thank you, and Susan Christensen, who I thought was coming tonight. She was on the registration, but I guess she's not here. I received a lot of help from them in the beginning stages, and Dick was very helpful in advising me about doing a book, as he had just done one. So I received a lot of help and assistance in the background here. And here's the thing. I didn't write this book. Vanessa Hua, upper left, class of 1997. She wrote this book. Once a writer for the Stanford Daily and now a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, Vanessa recently came out with a collection of short stories titled Deceit and Other Possibilities, and she has a novel coming out in August. I am honored that she wrote one of the testimonials on the back cover of Letters Home from Stanford. This book was written by Tamandra Morgan, who class of 2009. She's just arrived in Oxford, and she's one of 10 students who have letters in the Letters Home from the Overseas Campuses chapter, and there are a lot of letters in the archives from students who were writing them from overseas, because many students, if they've grown up in the Bay Area, they don't write home, but they tend to write home when they're overseas. Here she's just arrived at Oxford, and she says there are 44 separate colleges within Oxford and about 17,000 undergraduate students. This is in an email, and the subject line is First Week at Oxford. She's just thrilled to be there. This book was written by Russell Smith, class of 1941. Don't say anything to Mother. This is one of my personal favorites from the book. Russell has just been up in the city for the evening, and it's 2 a.m. and he runs into car trouble. And he's sharing this with his dad, but then at the end of the paragraph comes this line. Now, there's again, it's not all funny and laughs. There's a very serious letter by a young man in 1900 who comes from very modest beginnings, and he doesn't feel comfortable bringing his friends from Stanford home. It's a sad letter, and he says, "Please," this is to his mother, "please look around for a new house right away, won't you?" And this is another one of those letters, the interior Stanford thing. I don't think he was talking to his friends on the corridor about this. So he's a beautiful writer. He also has a letter in the book, that starts, "It's my 21st birthday," and then all these ruminations about what that means in his life. Let's see. Next we have, this book was written by Hope Snedden. Hope grew up on the East Coast and transferred to Columbia, but her letters are so wonderful that we'll forgive her for that. And literally, she made me laugh out loud as I was sitting in the special collections section. I had to excuse myself. One of her best lines was shortly after she arrived at Stanford, and she says to her, she writes her parents, "No roommate, but there's a girl next to me who comes in and tells me all her troubles by the hour. I don't give a hang whether she marries Arthur or Dick." There's a few members of her family here. Hope belongs to a very large Stanford family, by the way, perhaps only to be rivaled in number by the Gould family. So here we have Babe and Richard again. And members of the Gould family also wrote this book, and they did a lot of readings too, and thanks to both of you for that. This book was also written by Nancy Christine Smith, Master's in Economics, 1947. And we've talked a little bit about her, but I want to just add a few other things. She served this university really well. A little bit more of a hidden figure, I would say, on campus. She has a wonderful letter in the book about getting in all the wrong registration lines on Reg Day, shortly after she's arrived. She raised up 4 kids in this house next to the president's, and she gave an assist in raising up so many of these other students who boarded at the Krieger household. She cooked dinner for 8 to 12 people 5 or 6 nights a week for 50 years. That's an accomplishment. She also headed the faculty spouses French club. While she was doing all this, she also had polling stations at her house for the neighborhood for many, many years. She really made a difference in this university. There are a lot of people who were her boarders, who are out in the world today, who were benefited from living in her home. And just a couple quick stories. There was one person who had unassigned housing, showed up on campus. He lived at the Kriegers for 4 years, all of his undergraduate years. He went to MIT to major in physics, decided he didn't like it, applied to medical school. I don't know if he had to do the interview with Dr. Krieger or not, but he got in, he came back, and he lived at the Kriegers all through medical school. So she really had a touch. A similar story is one student felt it was time for him to be in an apartment, but after he moved in the apartment, he missed it, and he worked out a meal plan, so he came for dinners to the Kriegers. So she's just an inspiration. This book was written by Joe Jacobs, class of 1965, who also served this university really well. He was super busy. He was entertainment editor of the Daily. And this is him and his best friend were both on the Daily, and this is their photo in the quad that one year. He was in the band. He was in Gaieties and many other theatrical productions on campus. And he was a producer of Gaieties one year, although it was the year that JFK was killed, so only one or two of his shows were performed. Joe also served in the larger sense, and tragically, he was killed in Vietnam less than 2 years after he graduated. And we are so blessed to have his letters. I feel there's parts of him that are still there in these letters. He's survived today by his twin brother, Carl, who attended Cal at the same time that Joe was at Stanford. And there's lots of very funny quips in Joe's letters. They share a Plymouth, too. Then it goes back and forth across the bridges. And they don't want to, neither of them wants to use the phone to call home because that costs money. So he writes, actually, a few of Carl's letters mistakenly got in when they were donating them to the archives. Anyway, who's paying for the battery? All these sort of, who gets it big game weekend, all this sort of thing. This book was also written by Carol Stearns, class of 1947, one of the first women to study law at Stanford. For a variety of reasons that you can read about, Carol knew when she left class one day that the next day she was going to be called on by the professor and basically being given a grilling by him. Amid self-doubt, she goes home that night and she studies and studies. She walks in the next day and she nails it. And her whole story there's a resilience chapter in the book, and I took 3 different students from different time periods, and she's one of them. And there's letters from when she first started at Stanford and going through this process and the story of preparing for class that day, and then she's so confident afterwards. And I love her story because I hope it's an inspiration to any student who's having self-doubts. One of her first letters, when she gets to Stanford, she says to her mom, "What if I flunk? I'm scared to death. What if I flunk?" This is after a day where she enters Robley Hall, and it's a wonderful scene. There's all these upperclassmen, and none of them raise a finger to help her. So she's gone through that. She's figuring things out. What if I flunk? And then we see her a few years later just nailing it in a law school class. So that's just wonderful. She inspires me, as does Carol's fellow Storyhouse resident, my mom, Mary Allie Lesnick, class of 1948, which is where this all started. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have approximately 8, 9, 10 minutes or so for questions. And we've got a couple of microphones, if I can steal this other microphone back. So we've got a couple of microphones. So if anyone has questions, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. For either our author, Alison Davis, or any of our other speakers.
Yep.
Technical question. I know you mentioned this in your intro.
Friends, Romans, countrymen. How did you get the written letters transcribed into print? What was this? Who knows?
Well, Daniel had the letter. Yes, let's get around for the intro. The letters were in the archives. I started reading them. I transcribed a lot of them, and then I realized it was going to take me a really long time. So with the help of the English and History departments who put out notices, I was lucky enough to have some wonderful students who helped me out a little bit each week, and that cut the workload.
I have a book that's from 100 years ago, and it's all in the handwriting. Is there some way that I can magically change?
You know what? I remember looking into that. I don't remember. Obviously, I didn't go with it, Daniel. Is there a mechanism for that? Do you want to come up? Yeah.
So I mentioned at the conclusion of my talk, there is a new tool out. It's called HTR, handwritten text recognition. So it's similar to OCR, optical character recognition, which you can easily turn typewritten text into computer language. So it's just getting started, but it's not quite there yet. So the short answer is it doesn't quite exist, but there is a website called From the Page. And so we've put our handwritten texts on there, and we solicit users to transcribe them for us. So there is that means if you're interested.
There's also something called Dragon software. That you could, if you feel like reading it, it translates voices. So you can put it on your computer, or you can put it on your iPhone or whatever, and you just read. If you were reading the document to it, it would transcribe it, and it's quite accurate. Dragon software. Yeah.
I do remember at the time I was looking into this, which would have been about 4 years ago now, my feeling was I didn't want to risk the misspellings and the transference of stuff. That's why I didn't do it. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Over there, Leslie.
Thank you. I think you might have mentioned this, but I probably forgot or something. How long ago did you start writing the book?
It was about, I would say, 4.5 to 5 years ago, standing on the post office steps, conception to having the book in hand. Yeah, and it would have taken me longer had I not had interns helping me. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
When I read the book, I found the chapter on resilience was especially touching. Would you say a few remarks about that to us for the benefit of those who haven't read the book yet?
I take 3 students, Julia Hamilton Conklin, the one who became a math teacher, and she was one of 6 ladies in the room, and Mary Carol Stearns, and then a woman from the 70s who I quoted, and that chapter is constructed differently than the other chapters because I wanted people to have a feel for each of these particular students. They just all happen to be women. There are many letters written by males in the book, but and it starts with their early letters, and then you see them go through until they are in senior year, and they've got the hang of things. And there's a lot of phrases. I don't know how to study for the tests here. I saw something along those lines a lot. And then how they work it through until they are all seniors, and all 3 of them graduated. So that was something I wanted to share with people and organize it in that particular way.
How difficult was it to edit a book like this?
It was very difficult. I wanted the book to be 150 pages. I think it's 358. I had really a hard time cutting things. I fell in love with these letters and the people who wrote them. That's just the long and short of it. So I just had to look at themes and balance. There are, it's either 37 or 38 men and women represented in the book, and over 300 excerpts from different letters. And yeah, it was difficult, very definitely. And I do think I have thought of doing this at other universities, and what I learned, you really have to know the heart and soul of a place to do a book like this. I don't think it would work for me to go and do one at another university. Yeah.
What kinds of differences did you find, if any, thematically between letters by men and letters by women?
That is a very interesting question. I will say in the 1940s, now this could just be because of the letters that happened to be in the archives, so I can't say this is the way it was. But there was a lot about jolly-ups and dating and sort of the social swirl around campus that I didn't see as much in the men's letters. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But I'm going to think about that one some more. That's a really good question. Yeah. Anything else?
Any other questions from the audience? One more question.
I don't want to monopolize, but there was nothing about the war.
World War II?
Yes.
You know, I think there's a lot of letters in the archives, but they're from people on the front writing home. So the mechanism that I was working with of students writing letters out, the men weren't here. And those are in the archives, right, in another collection. And that is something I was aware of. There's talk of women writing letters, and gee, there aren't very many men on campus. I mean, there's definitely references, but That's the reason. And I will say I was very hung up on this has to be a letter from a student to their home. And as I moved along, I realized home is where a student feels home is. For example, Herbert Hoover was writing a friend in Oregon where he was raised after his parents died. And she wasn't technically a member of his family, but we loosened that up after a while. Yeah, I wanted some letters from him in the book, too.
Do you include anything about the angst that female students had about not getting into sororities?
There is a little bit about sororities, not so much the angst, but my mother actually wrote something about the sorority situation in the 40s, and she said, I don't see why we don't just have them. Women clump together anyway. So, why did they quit them? So, but not so much about angst. But she was not happy about it. She wanted the sororities on campus, and there weren't any. And then, of course, when I was here in the 70s, there were fraternities on campus, but not sororities. We all know that whole history here is unique to Stanford.
Great. Well, why don't we go ahead and wrap up? I feel that 125 years in the making, these letters, the history that's happened over these 125 years, wouldn't have come to light without your efforts and without your vision. And without the tenacity of 4.5 years of writing, and without that trip to the post office. So, round of applause for a wonderful. Thank you.